It is a fundamental premise of Marxist thought that as the material world changes, our ideas about the world change as well. And today we are experiencing the most significant material changes in all of human history with the emergence of the Anthropocene epoch in the geological timescale. What the Anthropocene epoch means in the terms of science is that human beings, anthropogenic factors, are now the dominant force in changes in the entire Earth system. This has taken the form of a planetary emergency. In fact, the ecology of the entire world threatened. We can understand this as the theory of the Anthropocene does, as an anthropogenic rift in the biogeochemical cycles of the planet, governing the entire Earth system. And the human production, the human economy, propelled by capitalism and capitalist accumulation, has now reached the point that it's rivaling the biogeochemical cycles of the planet, creating an anthropogenic rift and crossing critical ecological thresholds, what are called planetary boundaries, like climate change, the ocean acidification, species extinction, loss of biological diversity, the disruption of the nitrogen phosphorus cycles, loss of ground cover and including forests, the desertification, the loss of fresh water, chemical pollution, radioactive pollution. All of these boundaries are being crossed, all of these thresholds that represent the shift in the Earth system from a safe home for humanity to one that is unsafe for humanity, resulting from human action. And in fact, in the leaked part 2 of the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, they say that we are in danger if we continue on the course that we are presently heading of driving most species on the planet, including our own, into extinction. And if that happens, evolution will bring life back, of course, but it won't bring the human species back. This is from the part 2 of the IPCC report. So we're in a very serious place. You can actually call this ecological crisis, the Anthropocene crisis at this point. This necessarily demands a different way of looking at nature, really a more dialectical way of looking at nature, or looking at what Karl Marx called the universal metabolism of nature. In this emergency situation, in this planetary emergency, the point today has to be not simply one of understanding nature, but and understanding the world, but of changing it, and changing it before it is too late. Since Marxism is the primary basis of the critique of capitalism, of the system of capital accumulation, we would think that it would also be a leading guide to the ecological critique of capitalism. And this is true, but the story is more complex than that would simply suggest. In the 1920s, about a century ago, a deep chasm arose in Marxist thought when what we call Western Marxism, or the post-Lukácsian Marxism is another term for it, arose, the Western Marxist philosophical tradition. This was distinctive from the Marxism of earlier times, of classical Marxism of Marx and Engels, and also from the Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals, in that the Western Marxist philosophical tradition, beginning with George Lukács's History and Class Consciousness in 1923, moved away from the concept of the dialectics of nature, arguing that dialectics, and basically the dialectical method and the method of a Marxian theory itself, could not be applied to the natural world beyond human beings, beyond human society. The objective world beyond the human world was seen as outside of dialectical analysis. And this is because dialectical analysis was reinterpreted to mean what was called the identical subject-object relationship. So in human society, we can say that human beings are the subject and the object of the analysis. So it all goes in a big circle, and it's reflexive. In terms of the Vickian principle, they derive from Vico. We can know the world because we've made it. But of course, we haven't made the earth. We haven't made the physical world, the objective world beyond human beings. We've affected it, but we haven't created it, nor can we. And so since this realm is outside the human subject, it was seen within the Western Marxist tradition, which was very, very influenced by neo-Kantian philosophy, as I shall explain. It was decided that the dialectic did not apply to the natural realm. There could not be a dialectics of nature, or even a meaningful materialist conception of nature. At the same time as this was going on, and in fact, Western Marxism was partly a response to it, the Soviet Marxism, official Marxism, turned into a more dogmatic form. In the early years of the Soviet Union, there had been major developments in ecological analysis, revolutionary ecological analysis, rooted in the dialectics of nature and materialism, the most advanced ecological analysis in the entire world, including insights into the origin of life, the nature of the biosphere, the origins of human crops, and many other breakthroughs were made in this period. And yet in the mid-1930s, Stalin's system took over. Stalin became the predominant figure in the Soviet Union and unleashed purges that ended up purging and in many cases executing the leading ecological thinkers, with the result that Soviet ecology diminished. Concept of the dialectics of nature became a very dogmatic frame, rigid and estranged from social analysis. And Western Marxism had developed before this shift occurred, but became perhaps more extreme in its rejection of the dialectics of nature and the dialectical materialism in response to the dogmatic views of official Marxism in the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, even though this happened, and this has been very destructive to Marxian theory and to the development of the ecological critique, the truth is that if you look at the period from the death of Darwin and Marx deaths of Darwin and Marx in 1882 and 1883, respectively, we find that Marxian ecology and socialist thinkers, historical materialists, played the leading role in the development, certainly a formative role, but I think the leading role in the development of the ecological critique and ecological science. So this is the story told in The Return of Nature. But the story is complicated by the fact that so much of this is dependent on the concept of the dialectics of nature. So we have to understand why Western Marxists abandoned the notion of the dialectics of nature and what the problem was there and still is for much of Marxist theory. And from there, we can then go and look at, well, what did Engels do and what Marx and Engels do in terms of the development of dialectics in this sphere, and how did other thinkers build on it, and why this is so essential today in order to deal with our global ecological crisis, our planetary emergency. What can we learn from this in order that will allow us to move on? The important thing about post-Lukácsian Marxism is this complete rejection of not only the dialectics of nature, but because of that, the rejection of any analysis of nature, any meaningful ecological analysis, any meaningful relation to science, natural science, within the dominant philosophical tradition of Western Marxism, which really has governed most Marxist thought in Europe and the United States and even Latin America in the post-Second World War period in particular. Now, it all starts with Lukács's History and Class Consciousness. George Lukács in 1923 published this fundamental work, and in footnote 6, which was only about 6 or 7 lines long, he criticized Engels's notion of the dialectics of nature, saying that Engels had not got it right, that he had mistakenly followed Hegel's lead, and that the dialectics of nature was not capable of looking at dialectics from the standpoint of the natural world, was not sufficient in order to address dialectics in the social sense, the identical subject-object, the role that Lukács gave to the proletariat of being both the subject and object of its own action, and being able to understand the world as completely reflective in that sense, reflexive in that sense. A dialectics of nature, referring to the natural world outside the human subject, lacked this perspective, Lukács said, in just a few lines. What's not noticed usually is that later in the same book, Lukács said that a merely objective dialectics of nature was acceptable, that was meaningful, and using the same terms that Engels had, referring to a merely objective dialectics of nature. simply that it was merely the objective dialectics of nature and did not reach the levels of the social dialectic. So implicit in this view, which I think is easily found within Marx as well as Engels and in Lukács, is the notion that there's a hierarchy of dialectics in which the merely objective dialectics is at one level, at a foundational level, and the higher level of dialectical thinking applies to the social world. But that does not exclude, logically, a dialectics of nature, which actually is increasingly important in our present situation. Now, after Lukács, in post-Lukácsian Marxism or Western Marxism, they rejected the dialectics of nature categorically. Unlike Lukács, and Lukács later on returned to the dialectics of nature and expanded on it in his analysis. But Western Marxism, post-Lukácsian Marxism, was defined by taking Lukács's footnote and turning this into a categorical rejection of the dialectics of nature on neo-Kantian grounds, meaning that we had to look at the world in neo-Kantian dualist terms. Lukács had said, well, Marxism is about totality, but in Western Marxism, the totality just became society divorced from nature, since there could be no dialectics of nature and really no materialist conception of history, because on neo-Kantian grounds, we couldn't know about the thing in itself, the world beyond the human subject. They tried to develop a conception of the social world that was materialist, but nonetheless entirely divorced from the materialist conception of nature, from the physical world, the earth itself. So the result was a analysis that was very empty of any kind of genuine ecological or naturalistic thinking. For example, if you look at Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno's Dialectics of the Enlightenment, which is often seen as a work that comments on environmental issues, they criticize the domination of nature, but for them the domination of nature simply meant, in Weberian terms, or neo-Weberian terms, meant the domination of the world by technology or the application of formal rationality. And they had nothing whatsoever to say about nature, the natural world itself. They couldn't, because they had abandoned the dialectics of nature, and they actually end up acceding then to the Enlightenment perspective. There is no ecological critique in any meaningful sense there, because there is no conception of the natural world. My book, Marx's Ecology, written in 2000, was a first attempt to deal with this problem by recovering Marx's own materialism. Marx's Ecology is most famous for its chapter describing the metabolic rift, which I had introduced earlier. The main intent of Marx's Ecology, however, was to explain Marx's materialism. It was the purpose of the work was to trace out Marx's materialism from the very beginning. It showed that Marx's analysis was not simply that of the materialist conception of history, but underlying it was a materialist conception of nature, and that these were brought together through a materialist dialectical worldview. So I went back to Marx's original doctoral dissertation, where he studied Epicurus's materialism. Epicurus was the greatest of the ancient materialists, and in Marx's terms, in his doctoral dissertation, Epicurus had included an immanent dialectic in his thought, because Epicurus swerved away from all mechanical materialism, from all teleology, that is, notion of final causes, dear to idealism, and away from skepticism. He swerved away from all of this. He introduced into a materialist conception of the world, which was ostensibly a view based on atoms. He introduced into it an analysis of contingency and freedom based on his famous notion of the swerve. He introduced notions of emergence and proto-evolutionary theories and how matter and agency coincided. His analysis recognized the human alienation from the world, from the earth, and sought to transcend this. And in many other aspects, Marx was very influenced by Epicurus's materialism. And of course, Marx, who'd been studying Hegel as well, approached this from a standpoint of Hegelian dialectics. I followed then the development of materialism in Marx's thought in order to understand how Marx had become such a profound ecological theorist with his theory of metabolic rift. It was necessary to understand his deeper materialism. For Marx, human beings were objective beings, material beings, because they had their objects outside of themselves, as he explained in the economic philosophical manuscripts. They were sensuous beings who related to the world through their labor and through their transformation of nature. But they could also be alienated from nature and themselves. And Marx built on this analysis throughout his work. So Marx's ecology was based on tracing this out, understanding how Marx related to Darwin's theory of evolution, and also, most importantly, the metabolic rift theory. But the Marxist ecology was incomplete in a number of respects in terms of the problems that we're considering. One is that it ended with essentially with the death of Marx and the death of Darwin in 1882 and 1883. And I talked a little bit about what happened afterwards in the epilogue, how Marxist ecological views had been carried forward. That was an early sketch in the epilogue of the work, but the book had mainly ended with the death of Darwin and Marx. And the return of nature then begins with Darwin and Marx's funerals. The purpose of the return of nature then was to carry the story forward in the century after Darwin and Marx, all the way to the rise of the environmental movement, particularly in the United States and Britain, in the 1960s through the 1980s. And it was in this period, particularly in Britain, among theorists who were influenced by both Darwin's evolutionary theory and by Marx's and Engels's dialectics of nature and materialism, that we see the emergence of these fundamental developments in ecology and the ecological critique, which are so formative for our present time. It was this occurred outside of, mostly outside of the official Marxism in the Soviet Union and outside Western Marxism, representing a kind of second foundation of Marxist theory with relation to nature in the West. So the return of nature deals with that, but in order to address that, it was necessary to address the dialectics of nature itself, which has been for many years considered off limits for Western Marxists. To understand the problem, then, it's critical to understand how Marx and Engels themselves related to this, and how this affected the later thinkers. And then we can turn to how this dialectical synthesis, the return of the dialectics of nature, helps us to address the planetary emergency in which we are currently placed. One of the things to understand here is that the Neo-Kantian critique started as early as 1870 with Friedrich Lange's his History of Materialism. And Lange, in his History of Materialism, attacked materialism, saying essentially that it was metaphysical because on Kantian terms, we couldn't really know the material world beyond the human subject. Therefore, any kind of materialism that had an ontological status that described the nature of being was essentially a form of metaphysics which could not be confirmed in any way. And Lange reinforced a view of the world that was dualistic, in that we can talk about society and the human world and the human mind and everything that relates to the realm of thought and social institutions. But in terms of natural science, while we can carry out our experiments and so on, there cannot be any definite understanding of the world beyond human beings. And materialism, therefore, can be at most a method. It can never be a statement about the objective properties of the world, about what Kant called the thing in itself. Lange also attacked dialectics, which was an attempt in Hegel and in Marx to unify our conception of totality of the world, both the materialist material aspects and the realm of thought of the idea. In Hegel's terms, since he was an idealist, the material world was seen as a manifestation of the world of the ideal. Marx turned this around and saw ideas or thoughts, human society itself, as rising out of the physical world, out of the materialist reality of the earth itself, in a process of emergence, of development. Historical laws were laws that governed human history. Human history was not directly governed by natural laws, but human history wasn't independent of natural laws either. And so this was Marx's perspective, Neo-Kantianism sought to cut all of this apart in a dualistic view of the world. And Lange often actually referred to Marx as moving freely in matter in one of his books. And Marx replied that moving freely in matter is just a paraphrase of the dialectic method, which is all about matter and motion, what we now call energy, and the analysis of that. And Marx went on to say in Capital, he argued in Capital that his dialectical method had to do with matter and motion, how the world, how the physical world was reflected, in his words, in the mind of man, of humanity, and but not in a simple way, because nature has agency, movement and motion and change and emergence, and human thought and reason enter into our perceptions of the world. So we have to approach this in what's called a critical way. The Marxist materialism then has a ontological perspective, that is a perspective on the nature of being, that says that human beings are part of the physical world of which we and our thought emerge. And so we are dependent on the earth, and the physical world, the physical universe, which exists prior to us and largely independent of us, although we can, as we know, have effects on it. And we remain dependent on this physical world, and we are part of it. Nature doesn't exist apart from human beings. Human beings are a part of nature, an emergent part of nature. In the epistemology of Marxian materialism is what we call critical realism, or dialectical critical realism, to use Roy Bhaskar. And this means that simply that we understand the world on the basis of the material conditions of the world at large, the physical universe in which we live, the material conditions that we transform through our production and that govern our lives. These material conditions are fundamental, and our ideas, our reason enter into the analysis and the understanding of this, but our ideas, our reason do not create the physical world. We are materially limited beings, and we can only understand the world dialectically. The last element of materialism in Marxist theory is practical materialism. That is the materialism that applies directly to the social realm, to the realm of human relations and interaction, where the identity of subject and object applies. And this is what we often talk about when we talk about the dialectics of society and the reflectivity of it. And all of this, though this practical materialism, the practical materialism in our lives is actually connected to the material conditions of the world as a whole. We're not independent of the conditions of energy. We have to have an integrated perspective that incorporates nature and science, as well as social science the humanities within a materialist worldview. In terms of Engels' Dialectics of Nature, his Anti-Düring and his Dialectics of Nature, which is an incomplete work, in which he presented the fundamental notions of dialectics of nature, he provided the basic analysis that was then to inspire much of ecological theory, and it's very clearly laid out in Engels' analysis that we live in a material world, that human beings are products of, emerge from the natural world, and so society emerges from the natural world. That the physical world, to which the dialectics of nature, independent of the human subject, arise. It's a world of evolution, of emergence, of reciprocity and repulsion and contingency and change and matter and motion or energy. It has a complexity as an emergent realm. We understand it in terms of various integrative levels, and a term that Engels didn't use but was used by later Marxist theorists. So it's a very complex, dynamic, motion-ridden world full of change, not fixed in any way, not mechanical, not to approach that reductionist methods can be used very fruitfully beyond a certain point, because we have to capture the complexity and change in the world. Engels introduced three dialectical laws, kind of brief summaries of how we could look at dialectical principles. He called these dialectical laws, but they really can be seen as what we now call ontological principles. The first one was the transformation of quantity into quality, and vice versa. For example, if the quantity in a molecule changes, the number of molecules, the various quantities within a molecule change, you may end up with a qualitatively different form of matter. And so quantitative changes can lead to qualitative transformations, creating new forms of organization, which is the way science understands it. This goes back to Epicurean materialism, where it was understood that atoms create assemblages, new forms of organization. So as quantitative changes occur, we have new qualitative reality. This fits with what we call emergence in a general way. The second law or ontological principle was the unity of opposites, or identity of opposites. The idea is that in our world we have various opposites, dual aspects, polar aspects of reality that are actually interdependent, interpenetrating, that represent contradictions and promote movements to different levels, new realities, new syntheses. So the unity of opposites is very fundamental to dialectical method and thinking and our understanding of the contradictions in the world at large. Engels had a way, in one letter, of referring to this. He said that in a love relationship, the power of the love relationship lies in the fact that you feel identity with the other person, and yet you also feel your own separate self, and it's this sense of identity and unity, which is the highest point in love. He uses to explain the unity of opposites. Of course, it has many applications. The third dialectical law or ontological principle was the negation of the negation, which some people find mysterious, but actually came from Hegel's phenomenology to some extent. The notion is that in Hegel that alienation, the separation of the object and the subject, the separation of let's say human beings from the objective basis of their existence, can create self-consciousness. This separation, this self-consciousness, helps us understand the world because we can see objects outside of ourselves. But then in a dialectical synthesis, we have to reunify our self-consciousness, our relation to the world, recognizing that the objects outside of us are actually part of us. So this is the negation of the negation. And I actually think it's the higher level of emergence. While the first law, the transformation of quality into quantity or vice versa, gives you the notion of emergence. The universe, and the unity of the opposites gives you contradiction and change and interpenetration. The negation of the negation gives you emergence in the context of development and historical change. That is the past that's left behind. The residuals become the basis of change in the future. So there's a dialectic of continuity and change. The past is no longer the past. The residuals that we leave behind are the basis with which we create the future. So that in Marxian theory, properly speaking, Marxian dialectics, the past mediates between the present and the future. The present is the moment in which we can carry out change, but we do it on the basis of what we've been given in the past, what we've created or what we've inherited from the past, with which we can reshape the future. So Engels developed these dialectical perspectives. He's often criticized as having a crude reflectionist view or a copyist view of epistemology, where the mind is simply a reflection of the physical world or a copy of it, a mirror of it. But Marx and Engels used the concept of reflection in a much more complex dialectical way, incorporating Hegel's conception of reflection, which had to do with the bending of light, and what Hegel called reflection determinations, which captured the unity of opposites and very complex notion of reflection in which the natural world has agency and human beings not only have agency, but thought and reason. And all of this enters into how we live and emerge in the world and into our material relations. But the notion of reflection, although seen in a complex dialectical way, remains essential from a materialist perspective, insofar as we have to understand that we exist as part of nature, and what we do is derived partly from the physical world, from natural laws, even though we are directly determined or conditioned by social and historical laws, which are an emergent form in nature. So we have this complex dialectical perspective, and it inspired enormous amount of ecological thought and development. In this case, we could look at E. Ray Lancaster. Marx actually said the metabolic rift. He was influenced by Engels's Condition of the Working Class in England, which focused on the role of epidemics and disease and how these were affected by social relations. And Marx argued in Capital, based on Engels, and that the metabolic rift also applied to epidemics. The epidemics represented a rift between human beings and society. And E. Ray Lancaster, who was Charles Darwin and Thomas Huxley's protege and Karl Marx's close friend and the greatest biologist in England in the century, in the generation after Darwin, and a major development figure in the development of the ecological critique and ecological science. In one of his major contributions, he dealt with the sources of disease. He worked with Louis Pasteur and others, and he introduced the thesis that based on a dialectical and materialist point of view, that all epidemics in animals and in humans were the result of human action, and that modern epidemics were the result of the capitalist mode of production, its commercialism, its finance, and so on. And he applied this to the area of the African sleeping sickness, and called it. It referred to nature's revenges on human beings, which was reminiscent of Engels's ecological critique in the Dialectics of Nature, where Engels talked about how by capitalism was undermining the ecological conditions through disobeying natural laws and undermining the ecosystems, essentially ecosystems. He referred to whole ecosystems in this context in which we reside, and he called this the revenge of nature. So this kind of thinking rose out of the dialectical analysis. But Arthur Tansley was Lancaster was a socialist, a Fabian type. His student, Arthur Tansley, the leading plant ecologist in Britain, and a materialist who was an opponent of idealist approaches to ecology, developed the concept of ecosystem based on metabolism. All of the systems ecology, whether ecosystem analysis or Earth system analysis today, have been based on the concept of metabolism, following the same pattern that Marx developed when he introduced the notion of social metabolism and the metabolic rift as an ecological principle. And Tansley constructed the notion of ecosystem influenced by this analysis and by Epicurus and by Hyman Levy, major Marxist mathematician in Britain, part of the movement towards dialectical materialism. And Levy had developed a systems theory, dialectical systems theory, which helped Tansley introduce the concept of ecosystem. In J.B.S. Haldane, who was one of the leading dialectical materialists who were influenced by Engels in England, one of the two major figures in the neo-Darwinian synthesis in England, which he then later integrated with his understanding of Engels' Dialectics of Nature. Haldane introduced our current materialist theory of the origins of life, how life arose out of matter and how life changed the atmosphere and became a force in the biosphere, using also relying on the notions of the biosphere from the Soviet ecologist, biochemist Vernadsky. And Haldane, along with Lancelot Hogben, on using dialectical analysis, attacked the genetic theory of race. They were the ones who essentially destroyed the entire genetic basis of race theory and the whole biological conception of race in the 1930s and 40s, which was to be of fundamental importance. J.D. Bernal introduced the notion of the negation as arising from residuals, explaining how the dialectics of nature could be operationalized. He introduced the notion of the social relations of science, which became the basis of the ecological critique of science. Christopher Codwell, who was probably the most brilliant Marxist theorist of the day, who showed signs of brilliance equal to Marx himself, given what he produced in his 20s, developed an analysis of the dialectics of art and science, integrating the two. Codwell said, "The external world does not impose dialectic on thought, nor does thought impose it on the external world. The relation between subject and object, ego and universe, is itself dialectic. Man, when he attempts to think metaphysically, contradicts himself, and meanwhile continues to live and experience reality dialectically." Now, Codwell's analysis, as Rob Wallace has recently showed us, is one of the finest examples of dialectics of nature ever conceived. But of course, as you know, he died at age 29 behind a machine gun, trying to stop the advancing fascist forces in Spain. But all of these and more analyses were developed at this time that created our contemporary ecological analysis, the ecological critique, that the dialectical aspects of it carried all the way down to figures like Barry Commoner and Rachel Carson, and gave us the materialist analysis of ecology that we have today. So this is quite a fundamental one. Interesting thing is that Haldane was the first to introduce the scientific data in a major scientific publication based on the research of his father, showing that carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere, not just theoretically, but giving us the measurements that are still considered accurate to the present time. So we had all of these developments in dialectical ecology, and the return of nature tries to explain this more. It explains how these thinkers got attacked on the Cold War, but it also explains how these thinkers got attacked after the Cold War, or by and during the Cold War by Marxist thinkers themselves, Western Marxist thinkers, and and especially Marxologists who might not have actually been Marxists at all, not in all cases. You had a situation where in 1968 in New Left Review, Perry Anderson, who's one of the great cultural theorists of Marxism and historians and certainly a major figure in Western Marxism, referred to the false science of Bernal. Certainly, Bernal was sometimes in some of his writings, mostly parenthetically, he fell into a Soviet dogma, but he rose beyond this again and again, and certainly his last works were his most critical of all of his work, where he dealt with the critique of nuclear weapons and nuclear radiation, warned of and wrote about the origin of life on Earth and how we might destroy it based on a materialist dialectical analysis. But Perry Anderson referred to the false science of J.D. Bernal, who was one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century, and biographies are still being written about him. What made his science false? He was, Anderson referred to the fantasies of Bernal. This showed a kind of contempt for the people who were actually the leading Marxist figures in the West. The British Marxist scientists were the most famous Marxist thinkers of all in Britain and also in the West in the 1930s and 40s. And then their existence was essentially erased, and partly on political grounds, but we can rise above those kinds of divisions now. In 1983, Anderson said that classical Marxism had never had anything to say there about the environment, that the environmental aspects had not entered into Marx and Engels' thought or into classical Marxism, which we now know to be completely false and in extraordinary ways. But this was an effect of this notion of that the dialectics of nature was not acceptable. And the French Marxist Roger Garaudy stated this and put the point quite clearly in his Marxism in the 20th century, criticizing this rejection of the dialectics of nature and talking about its epistemological basis and ontological basis. And he said to say that there is a dialectic of nature is to say that the structure and movement of reality are such that only a dialectical thought can make phenomena intelligible and allow us to handle them. That is not more than an inference, but it is an inference founded on the totality of human practice, an inference that is constantly subject to revision as function of the progress of that practice. At the current stage of the development of the sciences, the representation of the real which emerges from the sum total of confirmed knowledge is that of an organic whole in constant process, not only of development, but also of auto-creation. It is this structure that we call dialectical. Kant, in his own philosophy and his critique of judgment, said that we had to understand the world teleologically, that is, in terms of final causes, like God as the final cause. We had to understand the world teleologically in terms of its purpose, even the natural world, because otherwise we couldn't say anything about it at all. But natural sciences basically abandoned such teleological conceptions, and it sees the world as, in mechanistic terms, systematic terms, or systemic terms, or in dialectical terms. And it's the dialectical view which incorporates change and contingency and emergence, and contradiction and reciprocity, arising out of our understanding of how we ourselves interact with the world, and projecting that to the world as a whole. That is actually the most advanced form of thinking about the natural world. It's now exemplified in many of the analyses within natural science and within mathematics, and so much so that we can learn about the dialectics of society, how to look at society dialectically more effectively by learning in some ways from natural science. Even though society has the advantage of the identical subject-object of science, identical subject-object, the developments in dialectical thinking within natural science are fundamental and could help us facilitate our understanding of society itself. In fact, we are now in a period with of the Anthropocene, where we are facing the destruction of the earth as a safe home for humanity. At least there's the threat of the destruction of the earth in that way, and we are headed down that road. In terms of climate change, we have till 2050 to reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions, or we will not be able to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature, or even really below 2 degrees global increase in global average temperature this century. And right now we're headed towards an increase in global average temperature of 4.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, according to the latest IPCC report, which would, according to science, lead to the destruction of industrial civilization and threaten the existence of life itself. Certainly hundreds of millions, even billions of people in jeopardy. And so we are in a position where we have to think about nature in a different terms, more dialectically, in terms of the dialectic of nature and society. Some people say, well, we should substitute the concept of the Capitalocene for the Anthropocene, but that makes the mistake regarding science. It's actually a category mistake, a category error, because the Anthropocene is now with us as long as we have an industrial civilization. If capitalism was ended, we would still remain in the position, and this is the importance of the Anthropocene concept, where anthropogenic factors, human beings, remain the major factor, the predominant factor in Earth system change. This is kind of a razor's edge situation that we have to live with. If we have an Anthropocene extinction event, which means the mass extinction of species because of climate change and ocean acidification and the destruction of the human species, that is the ultimate catastrophe, the ultimate cataclysm. It would be basically the end of human history and maybe the end of the human species. Obviously, that's not where we want to go. We want to move towards a more sustainable society. But we have to have a sustainable society that co-evolves with nature, that exists with the Earth system. We cannot simply expropriate the Earth. We cannot simply rob the Earth as in the past. That means we need a world of ecological sustainability, substantive equality, and sustainable human development. One way to think about this is that the epochs in the geological timescale are actually divided into ages. And we not only officially still live in the Holocene age, which goes back 11,700 years and corresponds to the development of human agriculture and civilization. We not only live in the Holocene epoch, but we live right now in the third age of the Holocene, the Meghalian age, which goes back 4,200 years, which is seen as starting at a time where there was climate change that endangered the earliest human civilizations. There's controversy about that, but we're seen as living in the Meghalian age. I think just as we've entered the Anthropocene, we've actually entered a new, as we've entered the Anthropocene epoch, we've entered a new geological age. And Brett Clark and I, as professional environmental sociologists, have named this the Capitolinian age, because it's absolutely clear that what is determining geology now is the geological timescale within the Anthropocene epoch. It's human actions, human production, and the capitalist system, the capitalist system's accumulation and its expropriation of the entire Earth. So we have to move beyond that mode of a dialectical interaction with the Earth, or of expropriation of the Earth. The kind of alien mediation with the Earth in which we now live, in which the metabolic rift has now become an anthropogenic rift in the Earth system, has to end. And we have to create a more ecological system, world, mode of production, while avoiding an Anthropocene extinction event. And so Brett Clark and I have said that what we've got to struggle for is a new geological age and social age. The geological age would be called the communion, after community and communal and commune, and it would be about human beings, human society, the human world existing in a coevolution with the Earth, which is only possible if we create a world that also promotes substantive equality and sustainable human development. We're in a position now where we're facing a struggle unlike any that human beings had ever seen before. At times, human beings have been involved in the struggle for freedom. In fact, all through the history of class society, there's been a struggle for freedom. And humanity has also at times had to struggle for necessity, struggle in terms of necessity itself. And we are now in a period unlike any other in human history, where the struggle for freedom and the struggle for necessity coincide. That we need The struggle for freedom is the key to human survival, the only path to human survival. And so we're in a global revolutionary situation. Throughout the planet, there's only one answer now, and that is to carry out a struggle for freedom as the basis of the struggle for necessity, promoting the survival and the sustainable development of human beings. Thank you.